Welcome back. Tonight we're doing a deep dive into a really tough case. The 1991 Austin yogurt shop murders. Well, it became this 3-decade catastrophe for the justice system. Our mission here is to track this incredibly complex, high-profile case, starting from that chilling crime scene through years of, frankly, wrongful convictions, right up to a pretty dramatic resolution that was driven by science, announced just in 2025.
Right.
The whole timeline, it's just a profound lesson in procedural failure, but also eventually forensic triumph.
Yeah, and what's really essential for you, the listener, to grasp is that this case shows two critical things happening at once.
Okay.
First, the incredible way forensic science has evolved.
Right.
But second, and maybe more importantly, the immense damage that can happen when you have information overload and just basic human error, specifically really bad procedure taking over an investigation.
The initial facts of the crime itself are just horrific and maybe deceptively simple on the surface.
How way?
It was Friday, December 6th, 1991, the location, and I can't believe it's a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. The victims were 4 teenage girls, just devastating. Amy Ayers, only 13, Eliza Thomas, 17, Jennifer Harbison, also 17, and her younger sister, Sarah Harbison, who was 15.
And the context there is important, too. Jennifer and Eliza actually worked at the shop.
Right, they were employees.
And Sarah and Amy, they were just friends waiting for a ride home after the shop closed at 11 p.m. Just kids waiting for a ride.
So let's look at that final hour, because it's chilling. We know roughly an hour before closing, maybe around 10 p.m., a man came in and asked to use the public bathroom, which was in the back.
And investigators later theorized, though couldn't prove definitively, that he might have jammed a rear door open then, left it unsecured.
That's a key detail. Then fast forward almost to 11 p.m., right at closing time. A couple was leaving the shop, and they reported seeing 2 men inside acting. Well, acting furtively, sitting at a table just as Jennifer was locking the front door for the night.
Exactly. And that potential unsecured back door, plus the 2 men seen right at closing, it all becomes critical later.
So what happens next?
Well, around midnight, maybe a bit after, a patrol officer just happens to notice smoke, a fire coming from the yogurt shop.
Okay.
First responders get there, they go inside, and that's when they discover the 4 bodies.
Yeah.
All nude. And the method was brutal, execution style. All 4 had been shot in the head.
Execution style. But didn't they find something else unusual about the weapons?
Yes.
Yeah.
That complicated things immediately. They determined pretty quickly that 2 different types of handguns were used, both a .22 caliber and a .38 caliber pistol, which, suggests maybe more than one shooter, or at least someone very prepared.
And the scene itself, the way the victims were found, it suggested something quite organized, didn't it? Not random, not spontaneous.
Precisely. That was the initial read. 3 of the girls, Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer, were found together. They were severely charred by the fire, and they had been gagged and bound using their own underwear.
Oh, terrible.
All 3 shot in the back of the head. Amy Ayers, the youngest, was found in a separate area of the shop.
Okay.
She wasn't as badly charred, but still had severe 2nd and 3rd degree burns over maybe 25–30% of her body. She had some kind of sock-like cloth tied around her neck. And she had 2 bullet wounds. One actually missed her brain, incredibly, but the other caused devastating brain damage.
So the initial analysis, looking at all that, the victim control, the binding, the arson to destroy evidence, it pointed straight towards experienced adult criminals, right? Not teenagers.
That was a profile, yes.
Yeah.
It seemed like a planned, controlled event by people who knew what they were doing.
So if that was the initial thought, how did the investigation then pivot so drastically towards teenagers? It seems like a huge leap.
Yeah, it does. The problem was the investigative team got hit by just an avalanche of noise right away. Bad information.
How bad?
According to reports from the time, over 50 people confessed to these murders.
50 confessions. That's
No.
unbelievable.
It included people like the notorious serial killer Kenneth McDuff.
Uh-huh.
He was eventually ruled out, but you can imagine the chaos. They even had these detailed confessions from 2 Mexican nationals back in '92 that also turned out to be completely false. They were just drowning in misinformation.
Okay, so fast forward a few years. The case goes cold, presumably.
Essentially, until a new detective takes over and decides to focus on a group of 4 young men who were teenagers back in 1991, living in the area, knew each other. By this time, they were in their early 20s. Their names were Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Welborn.
And this is where the major problems, the procedural failings, really start to derail the whole thing for, what, over a decade?
This is the critical turning point towards wrongful conviction.
Yes.
Because the prosecution, When they finally brought charges against Springsteen and Scott, relied entirely on self-incriminating statements, confessions.
Entirely. No physical evidence linking them.
Absolutely zero hard evidence presented at trial connecting them physically to that crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing. Just the confessions.
But confessions can be powerful in court.
They can be, but here's the kicker. The initial interrogations of these guys back in 1991, they weren't recorded, audio or video.
Ah, so there's no way to know what really happened in those rooms.
Exactly. It became impossible to prove later whether the detectives might have, intentionally or not, fed key non-public details about the crime scene to these suspects, details they then repeated back in their supposed confessions, making them sound authentic.
And wasn't there like a specific issue with one of the detectives involved, someone with a history?
Yes, that's a crucial point.
Right.
One of the detectives, Hector Polanco, had a documented history. He was known for coercing false confessions in another very high-profile, notorious Texas case, the Christopher Ochoa and Richard Danziger case.
So a detective known for forcing false confessions was involved here. They get these unrecorded confessions, and the system just runs with it. How did that hold up for so long?
Well, it did, tragically. Springsteen was convicted, sentenced to death. That was later commuted to life in 2005, but only because of a Supreme Court ruling, Roper v. Simmons, which banned the death penalty for crimes committed as a juvenile.
Okay.
Michael Scott was also convicted and got a life sentence. But then, years later, their convictions were overturned by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, not because of the confession issue initially, but because of a specific legal error.
Okay, what was the error? You mentioned the confrontation clause. Can you break that down for us? What does that mean in practical terms?
Sure. It's a really fundamental part of the U.S. Constitution, the Sixth Amendment. It basically guarantees anyone accused of a crime the right to confront, meaning cross-examine, the witnesses against them.
Okay, so face your accuser.
Right. In this case, the prosecution had used parts of Scott's confession as evidence against Springsteen at his trial, and parts of Springsteen's confession against Scott at his trial. But neither man testified at the other's trial.
So the defense couldn't question the person whose statement was being used against their client?
Exactly. You can't cross-examine a piece of paper or a transcript if the person who said it isn't on the stand. The appeals court ruled that using these non-testifying co-defendant confessions against each other violated their confrontation clause rights. That's what legally overturned the convictions.
So that legal technicality opened the door. But you're saying the real proof that exonerated them came later, from science, during the appeal process.
That's right. While the appeals were ongoing, crucial DNA testing was finally done. Remember, the Austin police had collected biological evidence back in '91, including from a vaginal swab from one of the victims, indicating a sexual assault occurred.
And what did the DNA show?
Subsequent, more advanced forensic testing showed definitively that the male DNA profile recovered from that evidence did not match Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. None of them.
Wow. So concrete physical evidence excluding all four suspects.
A brick wall for the prosecution's case, which rested solely on those questionable confessions. And the impact was huge. After this came out, 7 of the original jurors from the trials publicly stated that if they had known about this DNA evidence back then, they would have voted to acquit.
That says everything, doesn't it?
It really does. It showed just how weak the confession-only case was when confronted with actual physical proof.
So this brings us to 2009. Springsteen and Scott are actually released from prison.
Yes, they were released on personal bond in 2009, pending a potential retrial. But the science really drove that decision.
How so?
In June 2009, the Travis County District Attorney at the time, Rosemary Lemberg, went public. She formally requested a continuance, a delay in the case, and agreed to their release. Why? Because they had submitted the DNA evidence for even more advanced testing, specifically something called YSTR testing.
YSTR? What's special about that?
It's crucial for situations like this. YSTR analysis specifically targets the Y chromosome, meaning it isolates male DNA, even in samples that are mixed with a large amount of female DNA, like in sexual assault evidence. It's considered the gold standard for sorting out male contributors in mixed samples.
Okay, so the best test for this kind of evidence. And what did that YSTR test finally reveal?
It confirmed the presence of DNA from one single unknown male donor. And crucially, that unknown male's YSTR profile did not match Springsteen, Scott, Pierce, or Wellborn.
One unknown male, not the guys who confess.
Correct. Lemberg issued a statement basically saying, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, that she couldn't in good conscience, let the case go to trial again until they figured out who this unknown male donor was. She said it just wouldn't be prudent to risk a trial.
So the science forced her hand.
Absolutely. And as a result, all charges against both Scott and Springsteen were formally dismissed on October 28, 2009. Case closed for them, legally speaking.
You'd think that would be the end of the nightmare for them, finally free after years inside for something they didn't do. But there's a really brutal legal twist here regarding compensation, isn't there?
There is. It's quite shocking. Even though the charges were dismissed and the DA acknowledged the DNA didn't match, Texas courts later ruled that Scott and Springsteen were not entitled to state compensation for their wrongful imprisonment.
Why not?
The court's logic was that they hadn't affirmatively proven they did not commit the crime. Essentially, because the charges were dismissed due to the problematic evidence and the unknown DNA, rather than a formal declaration of actual innocence by a court, they didn't meet the strict requirements under Texas law for compensation.
That seems incredibly unjust. They lost years of their lives.
It highlights a major gap in how the legal system sometimes handles exonerations versus dismissals. But this profound injustice and just the sheer length of time this case dragged on without resolution for the victims' families either actually had a ripple effect. It helped push Congress to act.
Wait, this specific case influenced federal legislation?
Yes. The legislative history shows the Austin yogurt shop murders were cited as a key example of why change was needed. It was a major driving force behind a piece of legislation called the Homicide Victims Families Rights Act of 2021.
Okay, so what does that act do? How did this case, defined by old, failed methods, actually force an update?
Well, the act, which President Biden signed into law in 2022, basically puts pressure on federal law enforcement agencies. It says they can't just let cold case files sit gathering dust anymore.
Right.
If a victim's family requests a review of a cold case, the relevant federal agency must review the file and, importantly, apply the latest available forensic technologies, things like advanced DNA testing, YSTR, genetic genealogy, to see if new leads can be developed. It was a direct response to the kind of decades-long inaction and failure to apply new science seen so starkly in the yogurt shop case.
Okay, so years pass. The case is cold again, but now there's this unknown male DNA profile. Then finally the breakthrough comes, decades later.
Decades. On September 26, 2025, almost 34 years after the murders, the Austin Police Department finally announced they had identified the perpetrator.
And who was it?
A man named Robert Eugene Brashers. He was already known to law enforcement as a serial killer.
How did they identify him after all this time?
It was a combination of technologies. He was initially flagged as a potential suspect back in 2018 through investigative genetic genealogy, where they upload the unknown crime scene DNA profile to genealogy databases to find distant relatives and build a family tree back to the suspect.
Right, that technique has solved a lot of cold cases recently.
It has. But the 2025 announcement confirmed the definitive link. That partial YSTR DNA profile they developed years earlier from the vaginal swab. It was a match to Robert Brashers' Y DNA profile. Again, critically, it did not match any of the four men originally accused.
So the genealogy pointed the way, and the YSTR DNA confirmed the match. Was there anything else?
Yes, and this is really important. They needed something more than just the partial DNA. The clincher was physical evidence, ballistics. Investigators went back, meticulously re-examining everything. They found a bullet casing originally recovered from a drain at the crime scene back in '91.
Okay.
They performed modern ballistics testing on that casing. And the unique markings on it were found to be consistent with test firings from the specific gun Robert Brashers had used to commit suicide back in 1999.
Suicide?
When? He died in 1999 during a standoff with police, long before he was ever linked to the yogurt shop murders.
Wow. So two completely separate lines of evidence, the advanced YSTR DNA and the specific ballistics from the gun he used to kill himself, both pointing directly to Brashers.
Exactly. A dual confirmation, finally connecting the crime scene evidence to a man who had been dead for over 25 years by the time he was officially named. After 34 years, the science provided the answer. So when you really look back at this whole 34-year saga, what the sources clearly show is this devastating period, about 14 years long, where the entire investigation was fundamentally misguided.
Yeah.
Investigators relied on the most fallible human element. Confessions that were likely coerced, inconsistent statements, and just glaring procedural screw-ups like not recording interrogations. They ignored or didn't have the ability yet to prioritize the hard scientific evidence that, in the end, was the only thing that could actually solve the case.
Science provided the corrective justice here, finally.
It really did. It took way too long, but it got there.
So the key takeaways for you listening. This case really hammers home the absolute necessity of rigorous, standardized investigative procedures. It shows the profound danger of building a case solely on self-incriminating statements, especially unrecorded ones.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe most importantly, it demonstrates the transformative power and the ethical imperative, really, of using modern DNA technology like YSDR testing, not just to solve crimes, but to correct past judicial failures and even drive legislative change to prevent future ones.
That's well put. The science finally identified the person responsible. But here's something to really think about, a final provocative question for you.
The actual perpetrator, Robert Brashers, he killed himself back in 1999. The 4 innocent men weren't fully cleared until the charges were dismissed in 2009. Think about that 10-year gap. How much further could justice have progressed for everyone involved? The victims' families who waited decades for answers, the men who lost years of their lives in prison. If things like standardized DNA testing across the board and legally mandated recording of all police interrogations had been standard practice way back in 1991, what's the ongoing human cost when science and procedure lag behind? That's the real lingering question here.